All right. Well, hey, everybody on Instagram and everybody over on Facebook. Looks like we are live and good to go. We'll give everybody a minute to jump on here. But in the meantime, if this is your first week joining us, then welcome to the Reframing Foster Care Book Club. We are actually on week 4 of 5 weeks. We'll wrap up at the end of the month. Next Sunday is the last Sunday of the month. We are doing this each Sunday night in recognition of Foster Care Awareness Month. And so each Sunday night, 8:30 p.m. Central, we are jumping online and just talking through some of the chapters of Reframing Foster Care. So here's what I'd love to do. I'd love to know where you are, who you are, where you're from, where you're joining in from. You can go ahead and just leave that in the comments. And I'm going to be asking some questions throughout our time and would love for you guys to submit some questions in the comments. And we'll do our best to answer them. But one of the most powerful things that we've seen happen over the last few weeks is people sharing things in the comments, and then other people participating in this book club, in this group, answering them, and them interacting with one another, and just feeding off of the wisdom and the encouragement of each other. And that's really the heart of this, is that it feels kind of like a virtual support group kind of place. You know, I've found on this journey that there's a couple of categories of people in our lives. There's a category of people who love us, and there's a category of people who get us. And those aren't always necessarily the same people, if that makes sense. There's people in your life who love you, and they say, we love you and we want to support you and be there for you in any way that we can. But they don't really get you. They don't get what this journey and the nuances and the experiences and the emotions actually feel like. And then there's people who get you. Those are the people you can walk in a room with them and you don't have to explain yourself. It's just us. And we've shared common experiences and felt common emotions, and that's where there's so much power, and that's the goal of this group. So share where you're from, let us know where you're from, and then as people share and as people ask questions, feel free, please. This is a group of people who get each other. There's a lot of power and wisdom in that. And so would love for you guys to dialogue back and forth. Canada, that's awesome. Indiana, love it. North Carolina, Kansas, Donald, good to see you again on here. Washington, more Kansas, Atlanta, St. Louis, love it. Michigan, we got an email earlier with a great question we're going to ask from someone in Guatemala. So looking forward to jumping into that. Really cool to see everyone. So here we are, week 4, Reframing Foster Care Book Club. We're going to be diving into a few chapters that actually have a lot of cross-pollination. There's a lot of similar ideas between them. And so if I were to put a banner over tonight, the banner would be the sovereignty of God in foster care. And so we're going to dive into that. But before we do, continue to share where you are, where you're joining from, and remember a little one housekeeping thing. If your agency has said that they will give you credit, or your county, your trainers have said they'll give you credit, continuing education credit for participating in this, then email us at info@jasonjohnsonblog.com, info@jasonjohnsonblog.com, and we'll do our best in the next couple of days to send you a letter that says you attended and you get this many hours, and then it's up to you to turn that in and get that credit. So be sure to do that. info@jasonjohnsonblog.com. Guatemala, PA, awesome. Arizona, more PA, very cool. Love it, very cool. Found out about this book when I began my journey toward foster, adopt, and started a small group at Vertical Church, adding it as part of the curriculum. Very cool. Thanks for sharing, Angela. Awesome. Love that you're here. Gainesville, Florida on Instagram. Awesome. Very, very cool to see a bunch of people who get each other from around the country joining in and sharing their common experience. So, so grateful. So let's dive in. We are looking at chapters 13 through 16 tonight, and we're going to touch on all of them, but really we're going to try to stick to that, some big overarching themes. And again, if you've read chapter 13, 14, 15 specifically, you could probably put all that under the banner of God has to be sovereign over all of this. And here's what I found to be true, and maybe this resonates with you, that his sovereignty is my sanity most days. that I can't put my head down on the pillow at night and fully wrap my mind around all that's gone on and how I'm going to take care of everything or why certain things played out the way that they did without chalking it up to we serve a God who is sovereign and is loving and is good and is in control. And that keeps me sane. That allows us to rest at night, that we can rest in the fact that God is always for our good, that God is always working for the good of these children and of these families that we're serving. And we can put our heads down on the pillow at night, no matter what happened that day. And I know that there's a lot of extremes that happen throughout different days, and trust that God is good in all of that. And so one of the aspects of the sovereignty of God comes into play pretty significantly in chapter 13 when we talk about loving a child that might leave. And now you all know, if you've been around this space for much at all, you know that this is probably the number one thing that keeps a lot of good people away from a lot of great kids, is their fear of getting too attached. And some of us have figured out ways to maneuver over that. It never fully really goes away. You just kind of maneuver through it and you move forward. And for a lot of others, perhaps even listening in, it's still kind of a roadblock for you. And so we didn't unpack this in detail in the chapter, but I want to jump to a blog that we actually wrote after the book was published that we call 5 Things to Know About the Fear of Getting Too Attached. And it's arguably the biggest barrier that keeps a lot of great people out of fostering, and just 5 kind of things for us to hold on to as it relates to this notion of loving a child that might leave and the fear of getting too attached. Number 1 is it can sometimes be rooted in a flawed understanding of what the goal of foster care is. And we're going to dive deeper into this here in a minute, but that at the end of the day, the goal is that not so much that foster care is a mechanism by which we get a child for our family, but ultimately foster care is an avenue through which we give our family for a child. That it's first and foremost and always about our giving. Now, that doesn't mean that families can't grow through foster care, and some do as cases lead towards adoption. It doesn't mean that families can't experience great blessings through foster care. Certainly we do, but it does mean first and foremost that our posture is to give first, last, and always. That foster care is less about getting a child for our family and more about giving our family for a child. Number 2, it's exactly what these kids need. And that's probably one of the greatest encouragements for people, which is, hey, I'm afraid I'd get too attached. And we get to lovingly, gently say to them, that's perfect. That's exactly what these kids need, is people who are willing to get attached. And so sometimes we can kind of use certain aspects of ourselves and say, I feel like this aspect and this quality of me actually disqualifies me, when oftentimes that might be the very thing that qualifies you the most. I'm afraid that this part of me that tends to get attached and really love deeply might actually be a liability. And instead we get to say, no, that's actually one of your greatest assets that you bring to the table, and God's going to honor that, even if it results in grief. Number 3, it's not about us. I mean, that's about as plain and simple as we can say it. It's not about us. It's about what's good for these kids in these families. Number 4, it's not an accusation against current foster parents. And I know sometimes it can feel like that you can have people suggest to you, I can never do what you do because I just feel like I would love these kids too much. And what you hear them say is, you're just a soulless robot that clearly doesn't love these kids as much as I would, right? And so my tendency to love too much disqualifies me, but clearly you don't have that problem, and so you're okay with this, right? I don't think that's what they're suggesting. I think they're just trying to put words to something that experientially they can't understand. They've never been there. They've never walked that journey, and we have an opportunity to help them maybe reframe. That's the idea of reframing some of the ways that they might think about it. Kathy Birmingham, Church at Brook Hills, love it. Big fan of the church. Awesome. Number 5, it's actually about grief and not about attachment. And so let's dive into this for a moment. I'm convinced that sometimes when we share fears, and if you're in this journey already, you're considering getting in this journey, that there is a fruit to the fear that we express. And then often underneath that, there's actually a root from which that fear is being born. And so let me give you an example in this case in particular. The fruit of the fear is, I'm afraid of getting too attached. I'm convinced, though, that the root of that actually has very little to do with attachment, and it has more to do with grief. It's not that I'm afraid of getting too attached. It's really that I'm afraid I don't have what it takes to grieve well through some potentially painful goodbyes. And so it's less about attaching to a child, and it's more about my own capacity to grieve well. And it's important for us to really recognize the fruit, but also the root, so that we can really address the source of where those thinkings are coming from. It doesn't discredit the fruit. It's a very real, incredible thing. And many people have walked through very hard and gut-wrenching situations where they've had to let go of a child that they have grown deeply to love. I know that our family has, that we've sobbed over that experience, and it wasn't pretty by any means. It's a hard thing that will always be a part of you, no matter what. There will be healing that comes, but there'll also be a part of your soul that carries that little bit of grief with you forever. And I think maybe that's a gift. It just reminds us at the end of the day that this is really about these kids, right? And so we crawl into their stories with a little bit of grief and a whole lot of hope, and we do it again. And so a great question that came in, this one from Guatemala, from Kristen, said this: look, the pain of loss is fresh, as my first two foster sons were reunited with their family earlier this year. And then she asked a great question: how do I know when I'm ready? How do I know when I'm ready to do it again? How do I know when I'm ready to step into this again? And so I'd really actually love to hear some of your responses to that. How do you know when you're ready after you've experienced that grief? How do we know when we're really fully healed? You know, and I might say this, and I'd love to see what you guys have to say. I think that healing comes in the midst of the grief. Like, we've got to sit in that grief, and we have to honor it, and we have to recognize it for what it is. It's deep, and it's real, and it's raw, and we can't pretend like it's not. Healing comes in the midst of that grief, but full healing probably comes when we're ready to take steps forward from that grief. It's not that we leave that grief behind entirely. It's just that we decide, okay, now's the time for me to move forward. And the healing will come in full as we move forward. And we hold on to the reality and the rawness of that grief as a part of our story forever. And then we decide now is a time for me to rest and sit in this grief. And now is a time for me to carry it with me and move forward to experience full healing. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, as many of you I know have walked through that journey. Another question for you actually comes in the book itself, and I'd love to throw this out. How have you processed this very real tension as a foster parent that every foster parent faces, even in the face of likely heartache? I'd love to hear in the comments what compels you to continue to engage. What compels you to continue to engage, knowing that at the end of the road it may be full of grief? What compels you to continue to engage? So this leads us into the next chapter, where we really rest in the sovereignty of God. That at the end of the day, the sovereignty of God is our sanity. And that if God's not sovereign over all of this, I am not convinced there's hope in any of it. Because at the end of the day, and we've talked about this in previous sessions, that we can't control outcomes. And to a certain extent, God doesn't expect us to. I love Sally says, ready when you aren't expecting a new child to fill that raw wound, but he's brought some layers of healing. Healing comes when we choose to take in another kid. When our family chooses to serve others, healing begins. We miss our kids, of course, and continue to pray for them. Right. We sit in that grief, and we experience certain levels of healing, and then we move forward in that grief. And I love how it said not to fill that void, but to simply move forward and to find healing. That's great. And to trust in the sovereignty of God, that he is good always, that his intent for us is never evil, is never harm, is never bad. I love thinking of it through this picture of there's nothing that gets into our lives or into the lives of these kids and us and these families with us together on this journey that hasn't first passed through the good, loving, faithful, sovereign fingers of God. That he catches so much that we never see. And that's his mercy, that he protects us from that. And then he lets other things flow through only because he's good and faithful and sovereign. I don't know if we shared this before, but in previous sessions, but the picture in my mind is um, every Father's Day, videos pop up on social media, and actually next month, crazy, is Father's Day, so we might start seeing some. I'll share some, and they're of like these really cool dad moments, and there are these moments of dads kind of saving their kids' lives or rescuing their kids from danger without their kids even being aware of the fact that they were ever in danger, right? So there's one classic one where there's a dad laying on the couch and he appears to be asleep, and maybe a 1-year-old sitting behind him, just kind of rocking back and forth, and then all of a sudden the 1-year-old starts to topple forward head first down to the ground, and what we think is the sleeping dad with his eyes closed just kind of sticks his hand out and catches the 1-year-old by his head, right? Hero dad. My favorite is of one where a kid is riding in a little plastic car down a hill, and he's barreling towards the back of what looks like his little brother. And the little brother is completely unaware that there is danger literally about to bowl him over. And then we see out of the corner of the shot, dad sprint down the hill through the field and swoop up little brother before the car has the chance to just destroy him, right? Hero dad saved him. And I watch that video and I sit back and I consider, man, how many times has God done that with us? How many times has God swooped in, protected us from danger, caught something that was potentially harmful or dangerous or bad for us, caught it up in his good, loving, sovereign arm, because that's what a good daddy does, and we were wholly unaware of it. We were completely oblivious to the danger that was even impending on us. How many of you, parents, have saved your kids' lives? They have no clue that you did, and you kind of resent them for it a little bit, right? Like, if you only knew, right? I think God's up there going, man, if you only knew how many times I've protected you, how many times I've deflected things from you, how many times I've caught things that you were wholly unaware of. It's just what a good daddy does. And so we can trust in his good, sovereign hand. And we can trust it not only for us in this journey, but we can trust it for these kids as well. That God's ability to be good for them, even in a difficult environment, this is a hard one. God's ability to be good to them and for them, even in a difficult environment, is infinitely greater than any good that I could offer them in a comfortable one. I have to believe. I have to. Otherwise, I can't sleep at night. I have to believe that God's capacity to be good for the sake of others, even in difficult circumstances, supersedes my ability to be good to them and for them, even in comfortable ones. There's too much need in the world. There's too much hurt in the world. There's too many kids and families in crisis for us to believe that it all centers on our ability to be good for them and to them in a comfortable environment. We have to put our head down on the pillow and at some point say, God, I have to believe that you're in charge of all this, that none of this surprises you and that you've got it, that you are somehow, some way going to take care of all of it. And that's our ultimate hope. That God is in the business of the renewal of all things, and he has invited us to participate in that renewal. And it's no guarantee that we're going to see the renewal of all things on this side of eternity, but we continue to work in hope, and we continue to be participators in the renewal of all things, and trust that in the end, everything that's wrong will be made right. All the hard will be undone. Everything that's broken will be fixed. That bad things and hard things and broken things will not be final things. And so we work towards that end with great hope, experiencing grief along the way, great joys along the way, great uncertainties along the way, great clarities along the way. But what's driving us is this hope. I love Abby says the grief is hard, but after a while, the need becomes more important than our grief. Our work as foster parents is important and so worth it. And you know what? Maybe the grief that we experience with kids along this journey, and as we take that into new stories with other kids and families, maybe if we're able to appropriately and in a healthy way process that grief, it actually becomes a gift for those that we continue to serve. That somehow, some way, God uses our grief and our experiences as a gift to them, as a blessing to them. It changes the way that we engage them. It changes our posture towards them. It changes our hopes and our prayers for them. That our grief might actually be a gift for those that God has called us to serve. There's no guarantees in foster care, except that God is sovereign in the lives of these kids. He is good and will be good to them always, no matter where they might lay their heads at night. That his sovereignty is our sanity. Foster care is a beautiful expression of the gospel. It demands a selfless, costly, and potentially painful love for the sake of a child gaining much as we willingly give all. I love Sally says, we advocate, but he is their hero. Absolutely. We point to him as the hero in all of this. We continue to limp forward, and then we point to him as the hero in all of this, that he's driving this. Vicky says, we're compelled by the very next call of being needed again. You just say yes, you do everything you can, just like we did for the one before. Absolutely. Donald even says, not a foster parent, but what compels me to engage is all the people around me who pour their hearts out for these kids. That's awesome. That's awesome. That even the work that you're doing for these children and these families is not only a blessing and a benefit to them, but you're communicating something very powerful even to the people around you who are watching and wondering. That's awesome. Thanks for sharing that, Donald. So that leads us into the next, this idea that foster care, again, we expounded on this already, is first a family giving mechanism. It's a family giving mechanism that the goal of foster care is to give our families, not necessarily get a child. Can you speak to when our children who are adopted foster care are ready for more children to join our home again? Yeah, that's a great question. And it's one that I don't think there's a prescriptive answer, and I wish there was. And so I'd love for you to leave that in the comments or shoot on Facebook, especially where it'll stay up, and have people respond to that. That we want to be sensitive to kids that are already in our home, and how do we know when they're ready to receive more children? I think that includes adopted children. I think it also includes biological children. How are we sensitive to whether or not they're ready to take more placements? So of course there's a certain level of grief that maybe we as parents face, but also being in tune with the grief and the emotions and the perspectives of kids that are already in our home to ensure as best as possible that we're all in this together is important. Wish I had a clear answer, but it's so much contextualized to the nuances of your own children and your own home. But I'd love for anybody to speak into that has experience with that, how you navigated some of that. So the big idea of a family giving mechanism is simply a check on our expectations, frankly. It's a check on our expectations. I love it. Our adopted children started asking when the new baby was going to come. Yeah. We found that for the most part to be true for us, is that our kids kept asking, when are we going to foster again, and when's this, and why are we taking breaks, but of course that's not always the case, and so we just have to be sensitive to the seasons and have those individualized conversations with those kids that are in our home. Really what we're talking about here is expectations. Is what are the expectations I have coming into this, and what am I going to do when my expectations might not be getting met, right? And so for me, here's what I found, and you've probably found this as well, is that space between, that gap between, this is what we hoped for. Like, we got into this for this, and it's working. Like, we hoped for renewal and restoration and healing. And we're going to experience that sometimes. But there's also going to be this gap in this space sometimes between this is what we hoped for, and man, this isn't what we signed up for at all. This isn't what I signed up for at all. And what do we fill that gap with? I'm convinced that gap is filled with the mercy of God and the sovereignty of God over all things, and the strength and the sustenance of God to continue on. That gap is filled with grace. That God, this isn't what I signed up for at all. And it just helps to temper some of our expectations and ultimately build new perspectives. You know what? This isn't what I signed up for, but neither did these kids. These kids didn't sign up for this. And so I'm going to willingly continue to step forward. And the question would be why? Why do we continue to step forward? And ultimately, what I hope Reframing Foster Care helps us do is filter our journey through the lens of the good news of what Jesus has done for us. That's ultimately our why. That we continue to step forward because we believe that Jesus laid down the infinite value of his own life for our sake, so that we might gain life. So we then have the privilege and the opportunity to lay ourselves down for the good and the sake and the renewal of others. And not in kind of a light Christian cliche kind of way, right? Not in a feel good kind of way, but most often in a really hard, raw kind of way. Why do we continue to do this? Why do we continue to give? Why do we continue to step into hard places? That's raw and real. And what do I need to believe and cling to put my head down on the pillow tonight and sleep in peace? I've got to trust that God is good and sovereign over all things. And I have to, at the core of who I am, believe that Jesus laid down the infinite value of his life so that I might gain much. And I count it a joy and a privilege to participate in his renewal of all things by laying myself down and embracing the costs that come along with it for the sake of what a child and a family might gain. That this is our hope and this is our why. The gospel by nature is rooted in the act of giving. And that's why it's so important that our posture not be, what can I get? But how can I give? And how can I continue to give? It really checks this what's in it for me question, right? Or what am I going to get out of it? And then it gives us the opportunity to respond in one of two ways. We can either grow resentful or we can continue to grow repentant. We can say, I turn from that primary driving question, what's in it for me and what good is for me? And I turn to, how can I continue to give for the good and the gain of these children that we're serving? This is ultimately the root of the gospel. So, a family giving mechanism. There's a great story in there that I'd love for you to read at the end of that chapter. And then finally, it leads us to how foster care preaches the gospel and why we must let it. And I want to end our time actually not talking about something that's necessarily in this chapter, but I think it's relevant and it's important for all of us. But before we do that, one point in this chapter is just looking at the difference between opportunities and annoyances, right? People say annoying things all the time. And most of the time it's because they don't really understand what they're saying or what to say. And so they're doing the best they can to come up with what they're saying. And I share a story in that chapter about a lady in a mall food court who engaged us in conversation. And it was just turned into a really great conversation, actually. But it started a little bumpy, right? And you've all been there. People say things or well-meaning people try to encourage you and it actually feels discouraging. And so how do we handle those? And I think what we've got is a really beautiful opportunity to help build an infrastructure of thinking and thought and awareness into this foster care space, into the minds of people who are doing the best they can to put the pieces together. And here's why I think that's important. And I want to close our time tonight with this. We're going to actually dive into a Bible verse that we're all incredibly familiar with. And maybe we'll write a book on this one day. Probably not, but who knows? Why is it important for us to see this as opportunities to really share with people? Well, because for the most part, we live in a world that tells people, here's the objective of your life. That the goal of your life is to be good, do good, make good grades, go to a good school, get a good degree so you can get a good job and have a good salary and marry a good guy or girl and have a few good kids and live in a good house in a good neighborhood, drive good car, take good vacations, have a good retirement, and then have an easy, just die easy, right? And throughout all of that, do everything that you possibly can to avoid and isolate yourself from anything that is remotely hard or difficult. And if something hard or difficult comes on you, then you automatically need to assume that it's wrong and bad. Something's going wrong, right? This is kind of the matrix, if you will, if you want to go back to 20 years ago, that our world lives by, okay? It's the script. It's kind of the Truman Show, if you remember that, where he discovers all of this is fake. It's not real. The script is be comfortable and convenient and avoid and isolate anything that's hard and broken. And so there's people who are going to be watching and wondering why you're doing what you're doing, and they're going to be confused because you're breaking the script and it doesn't make sense. And we have the opportunity to help put some pieces together for them and explain why we do what we do and how we do it. So James 1:27 is a verse that we're all very familiar with, and I want us to talk about it just for a few minutes, and then we'll wrap up tonight because I think it's important, and it's one that really helps us biblically define what it looks like to be script breakers. Okay, so we're all familiar with pure and undefiled religion before God the Father is to visit orphans and widows in their affliction and to keep oneself unstained by the world. And frankly, it's a powerful verse, but there's pieces in that verse that a lot of us just don't really know what to do with it, right? Like we're talking about foster care, not necessarily orphans, right? And then what do we do with the widows part? And then what do we do with that unstained by the world part down there? Like I don't know, right? And so what do we do with this? And so I want us to spend just a couple minutes, right, to just unpack it a little bit. When James is writing, he's writing about putting our faith in action. He's writing about let's live out what we believe, right? Like let's do this thing. He's calling us to action. And so when he says religion, pure and undefiled religion, that word pure and undefiled, the root of that language there we get our word catheter. It's catharsis. We get our word catheter or cathartic. These are cleansing things. A catheter cleanses our body from impurities. Cathartic is an experience that's emotionally and spiritually cleansing, right? So he's saying one of the cleanest expressions of religion. Now, our word religion is kind of cathedrals and steeples and rituals, but the word that James is using here means more along the lines of an outward display of something that's inwardly true. So James is describing something for us here. He's describing a very clean and pure outward demonstration of what's true. Okay? So this is a descriptive verse. It's not so much a prescriptive verse. And that's going to be important here in a minute. It's also a descriptive verse, not a command verse. See, James isn't telling us what to do. He's describing for us what it looks like when we do certain things. Okay? So it's a descriptive verse, not a command verse. James says it's one of the purest and cleanest demonstrations of what we believe about God the Father, what we believe is true in the gospel, is to visit, okay, or to move towards, to incarnate, to get involved in, okay? Now that's different, that's script breaking, okay? Because again, the world says avoid, isolate, insulate. When you see hard and broken things, you need to move, okay? You need to do everything that you can to avoid hard and broken things. Step back and let somebody else take care of it. And James now says one of the cleanest and purest demonstrations of what we believe is true about God and the gospel is that we actually move towards, okay? That we lean in. And the language he uses there is not temporarily. Like there's a sense of permanence to it. One of my favorite writers, a guy named Henry Nouwen, says that we seek out the neighborhoods of the most broken and we build a home there. Like that's a beautiful picture. That's incarnation. That's God dwelling among us in the person of Jesus. I'm going to wrap myself in your flesh and I'm going to be among you, right? I'm going to live in your story. And so one of the cleanest and purest outward demonstrations of what we believe is true about God is that we move towards, not away from, orphans and widows. Now, James is a descriptive verse. It's describing something for us. It's not prescriptive. It's not prescriptive it's this, and this only, right? So I don't necessarily believe that James is saying it's orphans and widows only. Of course it is them. But I don't think if we went to James and said, James, what about those that are aging out of foster care? What about those that are victims of trafficking or homelessness or under-resourced or those living in poverty or my struggling neighbor across the street? I don't think James would say, ignore them. I don't care about them. Unless they're an orphan or a widow, then we don't care about them. Of course not. He's describing. In his context, in his culture, orphans and widows, the husbandless and the fatherless, were some of the most pushed aside classes of people. They were deemed socially worthless. You contribute nothing to society. You're actually a drain on society. And so they pushed them aside as invaluable and as people that could be easily written off, the most vulnerable. And so James is suggesting perhaps that one of the cleanest demonstrations of the gospel, of the good news of who God is that you and I would move towards and not away from the most vulnerable around us. Orphans and widows, of course. Struggling neighbor across the street. The struggling coworker at the office. Victims of trafficking, homelessness, poverty, that we would be sensitive to identifying opportunities where God is saying, I want you to move towards this. It's hard and it's difficult, but we're script breakers. The gospel compels us to something entirely different. And the gospel begins to change the questions that we ask. It's no longer, why would we do that? But it now is, gosh, in light of what Jesus has done for me, why would I not? It's an entirely different question. And the gospel begins to change our questions. So one of the purest and most undefiled demonstrations of the gospel is to move towards and step into the lives of the most vulnerable around us, because that's exactly what Jesus has done for us. And when we do that, it keeps us unstained from the world. That language, unstained, is the exact same language that's used in the beginning of the verse. It's this idea of clean and pure. So here's what James is saying. One of the cleanest demonstrations of the gospel is this. And when we do that, it has a cleansing effect on us. Like, it keeps us pure. That we're no longer stained by the concerns and the affairs of the world, because we're too busy being stained by the brokenness and the rawness and the realness of the most vulnerable around us. And I think that when we participate in that renewal of all things, God's looking down going, that's it right there. That's some of the cleanest, purest outward demonstrations of the work that I have completed on your behalf. And it puts Jesus on display in all of this. So foster care and adoption become these personal megaphones through which we publicly declare what we believe about Jesus. That he has the capacity to take broken things and make them beautiful things. That he is in the process of the renewal of all things, and we get to be participators in that. It declares to a watching world that we believe that God is sovereign over all things good and bad. And that even the worst of the worst, God is better than. And we believe that, and so we move forward in this. That this space and this journey is a megaphone through which we very cleanly declare to the world around us, this is what's true about who Jesus is. And this is the hope that we put our heads down on our pillow each night with. And we can sleep in peace. Because his sovereignty and his goodness and his grace in our lives and in the lives of these kids is ultimately our sanity. So, I wish we were in a room together. I wish we were sitting around in a circle together and sharing ideas, but so much good stuff. Heidi says the right thing is rarely the easy thing. Yep. And how do we verbalize to those walking alongside us why we keep doing this? I think one of the most powerful things that we can do is just to keep doing it, and that sends a strong message. But we can also just tell them, look, this is what we believe is right. This is what we believe about who God is. Not everyone will understand your why. That's right. That's right. And that kind of points to this idea that, again, the world wants to suggest that if you're misunderstood or if things get hard or difficult, then you must be doing something wrong. And I think we read about the ministry of Jesus and what he says, hey, here's what you can expect as you follow me. And he kind of sets up a very opposite idea that, hey, you're going to be misunderstood. It's going to be hard and difficult sometimes. Things aren't going to go your way. There's going to be injustices in the world, and that doesn't mean that you're doing something wrong. It actually means that you're on the exact right path that you need to be, right? And again, we can place our hope in that, and we can find rest and sustenance in that. So Sally says, more aware of our desperate need for him. Absolutely. Absolutely. Throughout our journey, Amanda says, I've kept a written running list of my fears in regards to the situations that we're in. I found it helpful to write it out, pray over it, and hand it over to God. That's powerful. And how cool will it be, and I'm sure you have at some point already, to go back and read through those things and to see how God was faithful through them and ultimately the resolution that he brought through them. That's really, really good. Vicky says, 20 years ago, a 70-year-old plus foster mom of 100 plus foster kids told the younger me that if it didn't hurt, we didn't love him enough. Wow. Very cool, Vicky. Thanks for sharing. 70-plus-year-old foster mom of 100 foster kids. She probably knew what she was talking about. So, well, this is great. We could talk for hours, But we're not going to. I'm going to honor your time. Don't forget, if you are interested, if your agency or your training office has said that you can get credit, you can email us at info@jasonjohnsonblog.com. We'll do our best to get you a letter confirming that you attended in the next couple of days. And if there's any way that we can serve you, support you, help connect you, would absolutely love to do that. So always feel free to reach out. Skim through some of the comments and some of the things shared here on the feed and interact with folks. Let this be a community of people, no matter where we're from, who say, look, there's not a whole lot of people who get me, but at least these people get me, right? There's going to be people who love us, people who get us. Sometimes they're the same people. Oftentimes they're not. And so let this be a place full of people who get you, where you can feel seen and heard and understood and loved. And again, if there's any way that we can serve you, we're happy to do that. So you guys have a great, great, great rest of the night, a great start to the week, and we will see you next Sunday night for week 5, and we'll wrap it all up. Thanks so much.